This video is sponsored by the Ides of March, who have two Warhammer 40k Golden Tickets event at their Warhammer 40k GT. More about them later on. What's up, folks? Welcome back to TacticalTortoise. My name is Trevi, and it's time for another episode of the best armies in Warhammer 40k. This is the weekly video series where we go through undefeated results from the last weekend and talk about what is currently undefeated. And it is Valentine's weekend this time around, so we actually going to have a bit of a shorter episode just because there haven't been a lot of events this weekend. Only about a half dozen, which means we get to dive into deeper event results than we typically will. But it also means that the meta gets a little bit of a respite as we prepare for the arrival of new units and detachments from the digital content update that we had last week. Until then, let's discuss a metagame breakdown and talk about what did do well this week. First of all, a couple different Space Marine sub-factions did okay. We saw an undefeated winning result at the Valley Forge Wargaming from Blood Angels, as well as one from Space Wolves at the Winter Donut Solo. Now, I'll give a little bit of a heads up for this event. This one was very hard to find results for. It actually didn't end up publishing its placings. Its pairings were difficult to sort of scrounge through, and a lot of the lists, the players did not actually submit lists for the event. So while the Space Wolves list here is the one undefeated list that I can find, there may have been others because it was a relatively large event. I just don't know. As we move on, though, we also see some other Imperium sub-factions doing well. That includes Adeptus Mechanicus at the Veterans GT and Adepta Sororitas at the Club Championships 2026. From there, we also see Astra Militarum. This was at the Hog Hammer event. However, I will note this was an X and 1 result. The player did win the event, but had a loss on the record because of the smaller size. Normally, we don't end up looking at events that small, but as I mentioned before, there were not many events this week, so we are going to be taking a peek at that. Now, I don't know whether this Astra Militarum used the new Grizzled Company rules. The winning list was Grizzled Company, and the event description did say that it would use the most recent version of the FAQs. However, it also quoted something around a 1-week rules cutoff, so I don't know which of those is actually in play, so I'm not sure which version of Grizzled Company these Astra Militarum did use. That said, we can go now over to Okeanos Rising, which was actually live streamed by our friends over at Viesla Wargaming, and this one had some absolutely nutty, insane results. That includes Necrons, as well as one of the most unhinged Chaos Demon lists I've ever seen in my entire life, so I'm excited to talk about that, which we will do just after a word from our sponsors. This video is sponsored by the Ides of March, which in addition to being a date is also the date for a Warhammer 40k and AOS GT. Ides of March is a multi-game event held every year in Central March at the gorgeous Samoset Resort in Rockport, Maine. This event venue features stunning views and an absolutely incredible locale, and you can enjoy those views while playing Warhammer 40k. The event will feature not only a 100-player Warhammer 40k major, but also a similar-sized event for Age of Sigmar, as well as events for Blood Bowl and Star Wars Shatterpoint. Not to mention, it's also featuring a painting competition for those who are more hobby inclined. I'll be there live streaming the event, so I'll see you there as well, as long as you head down to the links in the video description or hit the QR code on screen to get your tickets to the Ides of March today. And I'll see you there March 13th through 15th, 2026. Now, we're going to start by discussing our Space Marine factions and moving on over to the Winter Donut Solo 2026, which was won, or at least undefeated, was Andrei Ostrovsky running the Saga of the Great Wolf. This is the newer Space Wolves detachment that gives you uses of essentially combat doctrines that give you passive buffs for the entire army. You're able to duplicate use of them when you have Logan Grimnar in your army, which this list, of course, does. Now, in this case, we were running Bjorn the Hellfell-Handed for some command point regen. That was with a multi-melta on him, not his longer-range Hellfrost cannon. We also have Logan Grimnar and Ragnar Blackmane, as well as a Wolfguard battle leader with Skald's Foretelling. That is the Lance ability for him and his entire unit. He's going to be attaching into a unit of 3 head takers. Those guys are equipped with Storm Shields and 1 power weapon, not the double power weapon. Makes him a little bit tankier, but it does mean that you get less use out of that Lance effect. Now, moving on from there, we also have an interesting inclusion, that being an Iron Priest with the Chariots of the Storm enhancement, which gives you up to 3 redeployments for Adeptus Astartes units from your army that you can then also place back into reserve. Now, given the fact that this list was using several long-range vehicles, those tend to be one of the biggest most impressive targets for these redeployment effects. You can basically place them aggressively, force your opponent to play around the potential that they remain on the battlefield and go first. Then you can either redeploy them to safety, or you can redeploy them into reserve and then come off the table edge later. So lots of big uses for that effect, especially for a guy who's already going to be on the battlefield supporting those models. Now, from there, we also have a big Bloodclaw unit. This is for Ragnar Blackmane to hop into. They already have advance and charge, so they don't get anything from his leadership ability, but he does then transmute that leadership ability into full wound rerolls. When you can give these guys either reroll advance and charge rolls, which is incredibly good for a unit that baseline advances and charges, which is essentially allows you to double affect its threat range, or you give them lethal or sustained hits on a unit that has full wound rerolls. Either of these are going to be pretty impressive from your combat doctrine effects. And with Logan Grimnar in the army, you're able to choose an additional use of one of those once per game. So you get 4 total choices of combat doctrine. One of them can be a duplicate. Pretty cool. Now, in addition to that, we also have a unit of Wolfguard Terminators. That's for Logan Grimnar to hop into. They can potentially just go into reserve and then hop in turn 1, thanks to Logan Grimnar's ability. It is important to note that he only allows you to arrive turn 1 from the battlefield if you are Space Wolf keyworded, so he doesn't work on any of the long-range gun platforms like the Gladiators, the Predator, or the Stormspeeder that are also in this list, but he can bring himself in early. In addition, we also have a unit of Thunderwolf Cavalry, just a unit of 3 of them, to act as a little bit of a disruption piece, I guess. And then a Scout Squad for utility, plus a Fenrisian Wolf Squad to score some points, 1 Intercessor Squad for the back line, and a ton of shooting. That comes in the form of a Stormspeeder Thunderstrike, as well as a Predator Annihilator and a pair of Gladiator Lancers. Now, we do have access to +1 to hit for all of these things from Hunter's Eye as one of the sagas that you can recite. So you can get +1 to hit to all of your ranged attacks, which lets your Annihilator potentially hit on 2s, Gladiator Lancers hitting on 2s as well, which hopefully means that they get more use out of their floating hit reroll. So Stormspeeder Thunderstrike can give +1 to wound against a particular target, and also you can do the same thing for 1 command point with Eye of the Pack. So we can be getting +1 to wound on these 3 big gun platforms on potentially 2 separate places, and you could even, if you wanted to go far enough, you could get +1 to wound on the Stormspeeder Thunderstrike to then apply +1 to wound to the rest of the shooters as well. So you can have literally all of them have that wound bonus. So you're kind of aping Ultramarines now. We're hitting on 2s, we're rerolling with Oath of Omen, and we're wounding on 2s as well. Now, on top of that, we also have the Iron Priest, who's going to be able to give one of those vehicles rapid fire on one of those weapons. That's going to be either one of the laser destroyer shots from the Gladiator Lancers, or the twin-linked las cannon shot from the Predator Annihilator, which also rerolls its damage roll, I guess like the Gladiator Lancers do. So, what is likely, I think, to be the play pattern here is that one unit is going to get buffed up with that additional shooting. It's going to get +1 to wound from the stratagem, and it's going to potentially just laser cannon something down. If you have a solid number of hits, +1 to hit, +1 to wound, and 3 shots from a Gladiator Lancer, and you are not protected by an invulnerable save, the chances that a Gladiator Lancer kills an opposing vehicle is very high. You can then flip the Stormspeeder Thunderstrike into a second target, give +1 to wound against that, and also you get another Lancer shot and the Predator Annihilator shot, all of which can hit on 2s. We can't forget as well that you get a Hunter Killer Missile shot out of the top of the Predator Annihilator as well, and that is going to be putting an immense amount of damage onto a second target. So this gun platform is very well suited to knock out heavy targets, especially enemies that are not protected by invuln saves, as I mentioned before. And it's relatively efficient for what it does too, plus you get redeployments off of Chariots of the Storm. It's all pretty interesting. From there, you also just have some pretty solid melee profiles. The Wolfguard Head Takers are good as a bit of spot removal. The Terminators are good as a bulwark, where they can deliver Logan Grimnar, obviously a Bjorn the Fell-Handed, to sort of like bully the midboard. And you also have this huge brick of Blood Claws that can just absolutely power through something. Lethal hits or sustained hits, hit rerolls from Oath of Moment, wound rerolls from Ragnar Blackmane. It's just a ton of damage from these guys. Now, with that, we're going to be moving over to Blood Angels, and Angelic Inheritors is back, because we're going to be talking about the Valley Forged Wargaming Logan GT 2026. This was won at 5-0 by Jaden Jones, running that detachment. Pretty cool. After a never-ending cavalcade of Rage-Cursed Onslaught, we're seeing something else come out of the woodwork here. Now, in this case, Jaden was playing a pretty interesting list. First of all, we had 3 jump pack captains, no enhancements on all of them, just power fists, and a combination of hand flamers and plasma pistols, actually. I'm not really sure why we had different weapon options there, but we also had a combi weapon lieutenant and ordained sacrifice on that guy so that he can regenerate with 3 wounds remaining after he's destroyed. So he has a reactive move, lone operative, stealth, feel no pain. It's hard to get through all of those defensive layers already, and then he can come back when he dies. Very obnoxious. Plus, we have the Sanguinor. For those who don't remember, because it's been a little while since we've discussed Angelic Inheritors, this is the character-focused detachment for Blood Angels. So a lot of what it does is it has bonuses for units that are being led, or units with characters in them. Now, interestingly, it doesn't have to be Blood Angels characters. You just have to have Adeptus Astartes character units, which means that you both have the Adeptus Astartes and the character keyword on top of your units. And when you get those, when you get that, you get all sorts of bonuses. You get the ability to fall back, shoot, and charge, reroll 1s to hit and wound, as well as an 18-inch lone operative effect for 1 CP, lance, and lethal hits from Focused Fury. Tons and tons of really nice improvements for all these units. Now, why we say that it doesn't have to be Space Marine characters is because the last character in the unit is Inquisitor Kyria Draxis, which is pretty cool. She's going to be hopping into what I imagine is a heavy intercessor squad. That gives you a huge number of relatively resilient 2 damage gunshots, because she herself attacks 10 times within optimal range with 2 damage gunshots. Plus, you get another 4 heavy bolt rifles plus a heavy bolter out of the heavy intercessor squad itself. They're relatively difficult to kill. They're high OC, and they can hold down objectives, and they have an 18-inch lone operative. You can then use your 1 CP 18-inch lone operative on any of the other units that are being led, of which we have many. So that gives you access to a unit that can range out into sort of your expansion objective, be difficult to shoot off of objectives, even if your opponent's close, because the heavy intercessors do have a lot of resilience, and then also on top of that, they can also do some pretty serious damage. Kind of a cool combo. In addition to that, we also have an apothecary with Prescient Flash. This gives you a 6-inch scout effect on his unit. Kind of neat, especially when you consider that the unit that he's going to be jumping into is a las cannon equipped Devastator squad. It's been a little while since we've seen this particular combo put into service, but the reason that it's important that we have a natural lone operative effect from Kyria Draxis' own psychic power is that we want to be using in the Shadow of Great Wings to give an 18-inch lone operative effect to an Astartes character unit on the Devastator squad. These guys are equipped with las cannons. That 6-inch scout gives them a pre-game reposition, and then they're able to sort of move up to 12 inches top of the first turn to try to get a line of sight on something. They're then going to be getting that reroll 1 to hit and wound, potentially hit rerolls from your Oath of Moment if you're using it early game, especially since a lot of these units don't necessarily need Oath of Moment by themselves. So having access to it for your guns is actually really nice. Because we have that reroll effect for all their melee attacks, we don't really need it for the melee units, so the ranged units can make use of it. From there, your opponent just goes to try to kill them back. They have an apothecary, so they can reanimate 1 model back to the unit if they need to, and they do have 1 sort of ablative model in there because you have the sergeant in the unit who doesn't have a las cannon. So you can take wounds on him and then regenerate him or regenerate your las cannons back, and you can also make them 18-inch lone up. So they're they're not like the hardest thing in the world to kill, but they are annoying to interact with, and they're relatively accurate and do some pretty serious damage. That's pretty neat. And from there, we are also working with an Incursor squad to give them access to +1 to hit and give you additional scouts for the early game. A trio of Sanguinary Guard units. Those guys are going to hop in with the captains. One of those units is equipped with Carmine Spears, the other 2 with Blades. We also have a Scout Squad for your utility, plus a trio of Vindicators. So we have las cannons, Devastator squad. We have the Vindicators for shooting. Those guys can benefit from both the Incursors and Oath of Moment. Then your melee is primarily going to be the Sanguinary Guard units as well as the Sanguinor. Because they're character squads, they all hit on 2s, reroll 1s, and get reroll 1s to wound as well. So the entire army is super high efficiency. You have these high accuracy ranged attacks between all the rerolls and the and Cursor squads that you're able to stack together. You also have a 1 CP sustained hits for ranged attacks available to them as well, and then you're able to kind of threaten aggression with the Sanguinary Guard squads as well as the Sanguinor on top of that. Very well rounded and definitely more flexible than the essentially all aggro versions of Rage Cursed Onslaught that we've seen. It's always cool to see these Angelic Inheritors builds sort of pop up because they tend to be very creative, and this is obviously no different. So it's very excited to talk about this one, especially with Devastator squads. That's not a unit that we see very often. I guess there's also a little bit of a combo there because you can give them sustained hits. They can use their Armorium Cherub to automatically get a 6 once per game. So you can actually basically treat this as like 5 or 6 last cannon shots almost. If they're shooting their Oath of Moment target and they can flip one non-6 into a 6, the likelihood that they generate 150% hits from attacks is actually very high. 2 6s out of a total of what is probably 6 or 7 total dice rolled is a very high probability when you have an auto flip in there as well. So this unit's actually probably pretty scary. Now, from there, we're going to move over to the Veterans GT. That was taken down by Michael Stewart, who went 5-0 with a Halo Screed Battle Clade Adeptus Mechanicus build. This is very, very standard Adeptus Mechanicus fare. This looks like a list from a couple months ago prior to Adeptus Mechanicus's most recent nerfs, but I understand why we are playing it. Not a lot of spice in here, but it is extremely straightforward. That includes Belisarius Call as the Warlord and the only character of the entire army, 2 units of Skitarii Rangers to add Obsec and to apply the battle line buffs for the army. We have a single Scorpius Dune Rider that can carry around either some of those Rangers or some of the Sicarians in the list. The list is running a unit of 5 Sicarian Rust Stalkers. That's 1x5 of them, 1x10 of Rust Stalkers as well, alongside 3 units of infantry, 2 units of 5, and 1 unit of 10. We have a Servitor Battle Clades for some additional utility, a unit of Taraxi Sky Stalkers to steal objectives from people, and a bunch of shooting that includes a Ferromite missile launcher equipped Scorpius Disintegrator, as well as a trio of Iron Strider Ballistari units, 2 units of 3 and 1 unit of 2. Obviously, these guys have sustained hits. You can get hit rerolls from Belisarius Call. In this detachment, you can pay a CP for 5-up critical hits, which is good for both the Iron Striders and the Sicarian Infiltrators, both of which have sustains. That gives you more hits than you would average shots typically, and with a twin-linked laser cannon profile that makes the Iron Strider Ballistari particularly scary. Very straightforward list. It has lots and lots of good forward operation from all those Sicarian Infiltrators. It has lots of good utility and disruption between things like the Servitor Battleclade and the Taraxi Sky Stalkers, as well as the Rangers themselves and the Infiltrators. And then we have solid melee from the big 10-man unit of Infiltrators and the Rust Stalker units, in addition to extremely strong shooting from the Iron Striders in the back line. Basically throws a bunch of numbers at your opponent and hopes they die, and in most cases they did. Now, from there, we're going to move over to the Club Championships 2026. This one was won by Thierry Arcand, who won it using Adeptus Sororitas, and kind of an OG version of Bringers of Flame. We saw a couple of builds like this a while ago, but I think they kind of fell out of favor. But I really like to see them sort of come back into vogue, because I think they're really cool. It's just this enormous hull mass of Adeptus Sororitas vehicles that are really awkward to kill. They have invulnerable saves. They have this detachment. They have an Armor of Contempt effect. They have smoke screens, all that stuff to protect themselves. In this case, we are running Morven Vol as the only character in the list. That's followed up by 4 Immolators. These are dedicated transports, so we can play up to 4 as long as we have units to embark within them. They are destroyed if they don't have units embarked at the beginning of the game, but we will bring enough. In this case, we're actually bringing 1 of them with Immolation Flamers. All of the other ones are equipped with Twin Multi-Melta. So packing the anti-tank in there, but we do have a little bit of screen clearing if we need it as well. We then also have a single Sororitas Rhino. We have backline shooting from a trio of Castigators. All of these are equipped with autocannons, so the twin-linked weapon variety. The nice thing about Triple Castigator is because they have so many weapons on them, they have a Stormbolter, Pintle Mounted, plus 3 Heavy Bolters, plus their turret weapon, plus a Hunter Killer. They can usually split 1 gun off to apply their -1 AP thing to something useful. So between the mass of Immolators in the list and the 3 Castigators that can all shoot a main target and then apply their -1 AP buff to a secondary target. Most of this shooting is going to be +1 AP and ignore cover, at least when it matters. So these castigators with the rapid fire cannons are actually going to be doing some pretty serious damage, assuming that they can get the wound rolls through. We then have a pair of Dominion squads. Those are going to be combat squatting into the immolators. I think I would hazard to guess that we actually just place the Dominion squads in the immolators from the beginning of the game, because that gives all of them scout, but I don't know necessarily if that is the case. These Dominions are all equipped with melta-guns, so 5 bolt gun equipped sisters plus the Dominion superior plus 4 melta-gun equipped sisters, so that gives you even more anti-tank on the early game push. You're able to, with 1 immolator, apply 2 multi-melta shots in addition to 4 melta-gun shots, all on a single target. We then have a Paragon Warsuit squad for Morbin to jump into, a unit of Sanctifiers, that's what the Rhino is for, so they can bring you some scouting, long threat range, anti-infantry shooting, because they have mass torrent attacks, in addition to a pair of Retributor squads with multi-meltas that will typically take up the back line. Now, the reason that usually I think that you would place the Dominion squads inside the immolators to begin with is that getting the scout on those units is obviously very good. You can then disembark them and run them somewhere and replace them with the Retributors if you need to, but you also typically want the Retributors to hang back a little bit until the battle is joined and use the Retributors as a bit of a later game counter push, kind of an anchor unit. Basically, a lot of the way that this list plays is that it forces your opponent to consider extremely long threat ranges early, because you can scout, you can potentially Miracle Dice in advance to go really far, and then pay SCP to disembark after advancing. The immolators can disembark 4 melta-gun equipped sisters or the Sanctifier squad almost anywhere on the battlefield from turn 1. So your opponent has to really consider that, even if they are able to deploy in a defensive position. You can use the smaller Dominion units or the dedicated transports to trade for utility. You have so much utility in this list because you have so many transports running around that you're able to score points very consistently. Your opponent's then placed out of position, they have to push back to attack you, and that just turns on the Retributors bonuses, because as soon as you kill anything in the army, the Retributors get +1 to hit and wound against you. The other thing too is that once you push to the middle of the table, now you're in threat range of every single immolator. So it wants to either force you to deploy in the back and then draw you forward with its extreme threat range, or it wants to just alpha strike you into oblivion. It's pretty cool to see on the battlefield. It's a fairly effective variety of sisters play, and I like that this list is going really hard into the archetype, but it also brings a wide variety of different attacks, right? Bringing the Sanctifiers in addition to the melta-equipped sisters, in addition to the high-volume castigators, plus the immolators have mixed equipment. A combination of multi-melta and immolation flamers gives it a very well-rounded damage output, so it's able to deal with a wide variety of threats, which is cool to see. Now with that, we're going to move over to Hoghammer, which was won by Andre Gorin, playing Astra Militarum. Now, this was a smaller event, like I talked about at the beginning. The event only was 18 players, but ran 5 rounds, so most of the players ended up with a loss because they basically overplayed rounds from what they needed to get to a single undefeated in terms of Swiss pairing, so one player ended up coming in first with a loss, but thanks to the Swiss pairings. In any case, Andre was playing Grizzled Company Astra Militarum. As I mentioned before, I don't know if this was pre or post nerf Grizzled Company. The changes, in my opinion, were not wildly transformative. It did lose situational reroll 1s to wound, which is very sad for the detachment, but in many cases, people either played around that or reroll 1s didn't come into a huge amount of play. The reroll 1s to hit when you're affected by an order is definitely the more important aspect of that detachment ability. The other thing, too, is that they added an FAQ that made it so that the additional order sequence that you gained from Snap to It, a stratagem to issue orders out of phase, now is usable when you have no order issues left for the battle round. So previously, if you had burned all your orders in the command phase, you actually couldn't use Snap to It because you were limited to a maximum number of orders that you could issue in the totality of the battle rounds. But now that's no longer the case. So actually, a little bit of a side grade for the detachment, kind of nice. In this case, we are running a pair of Cadian command squads plus a commissar with abhuman detail. So I'm going to dual attach him with the command squad and then give a 24-inch master box range to his orders to Bulgarian units. We have a Militarum Tempestus command squad, Nork Deadog, in order to join to the second Cadian command squad to be a little T6 sort of annoying to kill objective holder brick. We have a Rogaldorn commander, a Cadian shock trooper unit to join in with the Commissar, plus a Catachan Jungle Fighter unit. 3 units of Adelan Rough Riders. We have 1 unit of 10. That's going to be a sort of a late game counterpunch. They're going to come in with reroll 1s ++1 to hit from fixed bayonets so that they can go in and deal some serious damage. 2 units of 5, which can be spot removal, but they can also just act as really fast utility units because they go up to move 15 if you have move applied to them. We have 2 Bullgrin squads for the Commissar to order, plus a Rattling unit for some early game utility, plus a pair of Rogaldorn battle tanks for a total of 3 Rogaldorns and a Tempestus Scion squad to join in with the Tempestus command squad. Pretty standard stuff for Grizzled Company. I don't know if I have much else to say about this. We've seen a lot of lists like this do well. Now, with that, we're going to move over to one of the bigger events of the weekend and discuss Okeanos Rising over in Norway. This event ended up with 2 undefeated, and the first one we'll talk about is the first place finisher, Lasse Tilram, who went undefeated with an Awakened Dynasty Necrons list. Now, we're going to see a lot of very familiar faces in this particular version. I don't think that's anything surprising to say about Necrons right now. However, it is cool to see Awakened Dynasty rather than Pantheon of Woe or Starshatter Arsenal, which are, I think, the other 2 really, really popular detachments. Now, in this case, we are running a Catan Shard of the Deceiver as well as a Shard of the Nightbringer. No Void Dragon to be found. I think people have been finding that the redeployment from the Deceiver, as well as his anti-character spike damage, and the fact that he's actually really small, make him really good. The size of what is effectively a Knight defensive profile on a 40mm base really changes how you can approach the table, because you can create situations where he can hide in areas where something of a similar impact on the battlefield would not be able to fit. And so you can limit the amount of enemies that can engage him, you can limit the amount of things that can draw a line of sight to him, and you can make it almost impossible for multiple things to actually deal with this dude. Plus, he's a little bit harder to kill than the other Catan shards, having stealth baked in. So he is just an absolute damage sponge. Now, on top of that, we have Imhotep the Stormlord to fuel some of the defensive stratagems that the detachment has. We have Necrosaur Amentar. Interestingly, we do not have Illuminor Siraz in this one. We are running only Amentar, but we can still bring him back and use his, I would say, above average, but not particularly crazy defensive profile multiple times, using Protocol of the Eternal Revenant. We then have a Scorpic Lord with an Agic Dermal Bond to get that annoying 4+ Feel No Pain defensive profile in there as well. We have a Technomancer. That guy's going to attach in with a unit of Canoptek Wraiths and a pair of Crypto Thralls. That's where a lot of our reactive reanimation is coming from. So we're going to be getting all those character-led buffs from the attached Technomancer. Then we're also going to be able to reactively reanimate them, so they're very difficult to kill. We can get improved speed or rerolls from the Silent King as well. And then we get utility from a unit of 3 Scorpic Destroyers, in addition to a single Canoptek Reanimator. Very, very character-focused this time around, not really bringing a lot of the backline stuff we would typically see, things like Flayed Ones or Ophidian Destroyers being left at home, but instead we are simply going to use the insane character datasheets that Necrons are currently utilizing in order to bully our opponent into giving them all of the primary and the secondary points so that they win the game, which clearly worked because Lasse went 5-0 with this list. Now, with that, let's finish off the video by talking about one of the most unhinged and insane brews that I've ever discussed on this series. This was second place at Okeanos Rising, which also went 5-0, so undefeated, just went second place on tiebreakers. And this was being run by Bjorn Olsen, who was playing Shadow Legion Chaos Demons. Now, this is the Be'lakor detachment where you're able to take Chaos Space Marines in addition to your Chaos Demons, and you get benefits for all of them. You get things like automatic passing Dark Pacts for Be'lakor himself. You get things like -1 to be hit for Tzeentch Demons, -1 to be wounded for Nurgle Demons if the strength characteristic of the attack is greater than their toughness. So, a lot of very relevant buffs for your units. What are we taking in this case? Oftentimes, we see a bit of a mixed focus between really big, heavy, stompy demons, things like Bloodthirsters with Fade to Darkness to let them jump into reserve after destroying something. We see Be'lakor because getting sustained hits or lethal hits on that guy is incredible. We can also occasionally see some play from things like Lords of Change, Great Unclean Ones. There's a lot of play with the big demons. In this case, we're playing 3 Exalted Flamers and a Sloppy Bile Viper. Literally no greater demons whatsoever. We also, this is fascinating, have a Chaos Lord with Fade to Darkness on him. So after his unit kills something, they can all enter into reserve. Now, from there, we are also running a unit of Chosen. So we have a unit that can naturally advance and charge on the battlefield, so they're relatively fast, and they have solid damage output. You can do things like use Channeled Wrath to give them Lance on the charge. They can Dark Pact as normal, and they have a Chaos Icon, so the chances of them failing are very low, so they can gain sustained or lethal hits. And then once they kill something, they enter into reserve. Now, the normal pattern with this, with things like Warp Talons, for example, is that you then Rapid Ingress them back onto the battlefield. Fortunately for us, Heretic Astartes inside the Shadow Legion detachment gain Deep Strike. So they're able to then return to the battlefield from Rapid Ingress using normal Deep Strike, advance and charge for free, because they're Chosen, back into the fight immediately after and do it all over again. This is one of the most creative places to put this particular unit. Sometimes you see this on things like Bloodletters, which are kind of a limited attack volume. They're very inconsistent on their damage output. The same goes for Bloodthirsters, which hit incredibly hard but have a limited number of attacks, and sometimes they just miss. Chosen don't necessarily have that same problem. They're independently fast on the battlefield. They have a billion attacks because they're a big unit of 10 guys. You get the once per game additional damage from the Chaos Lord as well, so you can punch up into big stuff, and being able to utilize things like Lance for free, thanks to the Chaos Lord's ability, makes it pretty reasonable for them to pick up light to medium units and then hop into reserve and then pay a CP and do it again. Really cool. Now, that's where basically all the damage in this army is coming from, because everything else is just scoring. It's just about, I don't know, 1,700 points worth of scoring units. That includes, as I mentioned before, 3 Exalted Flamers. Those are guys who are going to potentially be hopping into it. I actually don't know if they were joining these Flamer units or just acting as independent operators themselves. These Exalted Flamers have okay shooting. They're able to fire a blue fire that can do 3 damage, which is cool, or some pretty powerful anti-infantry torrent attacks. You also get similar things from the Flamers themselves. The big thing about the Flamers, though, is that they are 3 wound bodies for relatively cheap that also get a 4+ invulnerable save and -1 to be hit permanently against all attacks when you're part of this detachment. An incredible defensive buff for these things. Now, that's mirrored by the Nurgle units, of which we have 3 units of 1 Beast of Nurgle. So we have early game objective control with scouting Beast of Nurgle that can push up the table and force your opponent to come in and try to deal with them. That gives you something for your Chaos Lord to charge, so you can start his cycle of peeling your opponent apart. From there, we have 27 Nurglings. 3 units of 3, as well as 3 units of 6, for a total of 6 units on the table, 27 bases in total. That comes out to 108 wounds, all of which is at a 5+ invuln save, and potentially -1 to be hit if you're engaging them, -1 to be wounded if you're not. Extremely difficult to get through. So they are just going to morass the center of the battlefield and stop you from really getting too much onto objectives. You then follow that up with 60 Plague Bearers, 6 units of 10 Plague Bearers. Now, these guys are pretty nice. They're not the fastest thing in the world, but there's a redeployment stratagem inside this detachment, so you can uppy downy them. They get +1 to charge naturally as well, so they can potentially charge out a Deep Strike on an 8. It's not super reliable, but it's not too bad. And the other thing is that they're just really annoying to kill. They're toughness 5 baseline, so a lot of your normally anti-infantry weapons are going to wound them on 4s, and a lot of them are going to wound them on 5s. Normal sort of strength 4 stuff is going to bounce in a lot of cases. But then, even high toughness or high strength stuff, sort of, you can imagine heavy infantry sweepers like strength 8 multi-damage blast weapons wound them on 4s as well because of the -1 to wound effect from the detachment ability. So these guys are really annoying to take down. And if you're in Shadow of Chaos, they can start to regenerate themselves. All of the Nurglings and the Plague Bearer units can regenerate themselves if they aren't killed and they start passing battle shock checks, which means they can start to put more and more OC on these objectives, and they have OBSEC. So you're already physically blocking off your opponent from getting into a lot of positions on the battlefield, nor naturally. You just can't really get into a lot of places with the Nurgling swarms there. And then, once you've prevented that from happening, you can just run Plague Bearers or redeploy Plague Bearers onto all those objectives and OBSEC them under your control and simply bully the primary. These guys are going to do a little bit of damage. You have devastating wounds on the beasts. They can chip in a damage or 2 there. The Flamers and the Exalted Flamers can deal with infantry to some extent, but a lot of the actual output is going to be coming from from the Chosen. The Plague Bearers do have lethal hits, so you can kind of just spam lethal hits into a lot of stuff and slowly kill things. Plague Bearers over a long enough period of time will beat a lot of other infantry simply because they have high toughness and AP1 lethal hit attacks. So against like a lot of Space Marines and stuff, they will be dishing out more damage than they're receiving in a lot of cases. But the real hammer blow comes from those Chosen that are going to be able to spot remove specific enemies, then go into reserve and continuously repeat itself. So the fact that we're getting a lot of work out of this Chosen unit means that the rest of the army can focus entirely on scoring and really just bully the opponent into being absolutely unable to score and utilize the really impressive statistical improvements that Shadow Legion gives you, like -1 to be hit, -1 to be wounded, to keep these units going for as long as possible. What an insanely creative list. Oh, I also want to mention too that we do have the Sloppy Bile Piper in there. He can make one of the Plague Bearer units slightly faster if he joins them, but the other thing is that he constantly spams at the start of each fight phase battle shock checks, and if you have Shadow of Chaos active in an area, you take damage on failed battle shock checks. So a lot of times what happens is that he gets stuck into his unit. He's difficult to kill. You have to get through this whole unit with -1 to wounds, toughness 5, 2 wound bodies. It takes a while to actually get to the Bile Piper himself. He will trigger 2 or 3 times until that happens, especially if he's not engaging you and he's simply sitting behind the front line of Nurglings and you are eating damage on the Nurglings and the Bile Piper's just piping at you. If you can't shoot him to death, then you're going to be pinged in a big aura for D3 mortal wounds every fight phase, eventually to the point that he starts to kill you. So he as well can also mess up your ability to actually sort of engage with the meat of this army. Insane list. Absolutely crazy. You love to see really, really creative stuff like this. And I know that Shadow Legion has always had this kind of ability to build these really weird, very diverse builds because it has essentially 5 separate detachment abilities baked into it, which is crazy. But you don't ever really get to see them super often because a lot of times they just get swept by, really tough meta stuff, or you just end up playing Demonic Incursion or Scintillating Legion these days for Chaos Demons. But this list is incredibly cool, and it's cool to see it go 5-0. So big congratulations to Bjorn. And thanks for watching all the way to the end of the video. That's going to be it for this week of Best Armies in Warhammer 40k. Thanks to Ides of March for sponsoring the video. Thanks to everybody who supports Tactical Tortoise, whether that's over on Patreon at patreon.com/tacticaltortoise, YouTube channel members, and Twitch subscribers. All you people are amazing, and I love you. Remember to keep it classy, folks, and have happy wargaming.